Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to our second day of our training. Today, we're going to be focused on public safety topics, and this is timely, I think, given a lot of the events that are in the news right now, and as I kind of alluded to yesterday, public safety towers and NEPA in the public safety context. This is a recurring issue that we do run into a lot, so we've assembled a number of people today to speak to the NEPA and NHPA issues really from a public safety perspective. Some logistics before we get started. There is a sign-up sheet in the back corner there. If you haven't signed in yesterday, please sign in today just so that we have a record of your attendance. This stream is also being webcast, and people should be joining us on the web. If you're joining us on the web, please welcome. Let me go through the agenda very quickly today. We're going to be having a panel at 9:15 on NEPA, NHPA, and NEPA compliance for public safety entities. Then we're going to have a presentation from FirstNet. There's going to be a discussion on siting and floodplains at 10:45. At 12:15, we'll have a presentation on ASR and broadcast tower issues. 12:40, we're going to have a presentation from Joel again on making towers more bird-friendly, and we're going to try to get you out here by 1 or shortly after 1. This does mean that although we will have a couple breaks in between, we are not planning to break for lunch in order to try to get you out earlier today. On the back, if you haven't picked out anything yet, there are handouts that I think were given yesterday. I'm not sure if there were any handouts for today's presentations, but if there are, they will be in the back corner there. Same logistics go for questions as for yesterday. If you have a question, please ask. Write them down on a card that's going to be posted on this table or the table in the back. Raise your hand, and one of our FCC staff members will swing by and grab the card. If you're joining us on the live webcast, please send your questions to livequestions@fcc.gov. Again, that's one word, livequestions@fcc.gov. Caveat on some of the questions that we can answer, but may not be able to answer, is that if your question is very specific on to your situation or is a very narrowly focused question, we'll hold it, but we may not get to it here, but we may try to answer it a little later on. So to kick things off, I'm going to welcome David Firth, Deputy Bureau Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau here at the FCC. Thank you, David.
Thank you for that kind introduction, although you inadvertently gave me a promotion. I'm actually the Deputy Bureau Chief in the Public Safety Bureau, and Lisa Folks is the Bureau Chief. She sends her regards, but I'm happy to speak here on her behalf. So, and I'd like to thank the Bureau for inviting me to kick off the second day of this very important workshop. My bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, is the bureau that is principally responsible for public safety communications matters at the Commission, and that includes the licensing of state, local, tribal, and territorial public safety radio systems. And our policy and licensing division within the Bureau handles thousands of applications a year from applicants for public safety licenses. Public safety applicants sometimes think that the licensing process only involves identifying a frequency or frequencies and filing an application with us at the Commission. Not so. Like all applicants for Commission licenses, public safety entities are subject to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which establishes our basic national charter to protect the environment. Consistent with NEPA's purpose, the Commission's rules require applicants to show NEPA compliance before we can approve license applications for facilities that may significantly affect the environment. The rules generally require applicants to prepare environmental assessments for environmentally sensitive facilities and also to comply with the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act where applicable. The practical lesson in all of this is simple. Public safety entities need to understand the NEPA rules and make environmental compliance an early focus of their planning process for communications facilities, just as much as planning what radio equipment to buy or what frequencies to use. Putting off or ignoring environmental compliance is a dangerous path. There are public safety applicants who have learned the hard way that this can lead to costly delays, stranded investment, and even the necessity to redesign whole systems. The good news is that for applicants who learn the landscape and plan ahead, compliance with the Commission's environmental rules need not be burdensome. The rules are straightforward and were developed to protect the quality of life in the very communities that public safety agencies are committed to serving. In yesterday's sessions and continuing today, we are focusing on the nuts and bolts of the Commission's NEPA regulations, not just what the rules require, but how best to plan for and navigate the process. Our goal in this morning's portion of the workshop is to help public safety entities develop strategies for anticipating environmental issues and ensuring their prompt resolution. The presenters that follow me are the true experts on these nuts and bolts. They will provide an overview of the FCC's environmental rules, including those dealing with historic preservation and the Endangered Species Act. They will explain the relationship between FirstNet's environmental compliance procedures and the FCC's NEPA rules. And you will hear about best practices for siting infrastructure in floodplain areas, registration of antenna supporting structures, and how to make towers bird-friendly. Our first presenter today is John Adams. He's an attorney in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's Policy and Licensing Division, and John is our in-house subject matter expert on NEPA and other environmental issues. So John, without further ado, the floor is yours, and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, and before we begin, I would like to make a couple of real quick introductions. David called me the in-house PSHSB expert. I've always been uncomfortable with being called the expert, but until somebody recently told me an expert is simply someone who knows more than you do. So based on that, I'd like to introduce you to my experts, one of whom you've already met. One is Don Johnson. Thank you, Don, who I want to thank for having mentored me all these years on NEPA matters. Thanks.
Thanks.
In addition, I think yesterday you had a presentation, a really excellent presentation from Erica Rosenberg, and I would really commend you, if you haven't had a chance to listen to that or to view it, to go over that, go over the slides. I think that does a great job of going over the nuts and bolts and mechanics of NEPA compliance. But this morning we're going to go over some case studies to give you ideas of what can go afoul, there may be a pun in there, with the NEPA compliance. But let's begin with the fundamental takeaways. There is no public safety exception for NEPA compliance. It's interesting that we're breaking this out separately, because normally when you break something out separately, you're thinking, oh, you're going to highlight the differences. Ultimately, public safety has the same obligations as any other licensee. They have to comply with NEPA. But we also want to highlight that compliance with NEPA regulations will ultimately save you time, it'll save you money, and a lot of headaches. And so we want you to encourage all public safety agencies who are getting a license with the Commission to think of this up front. Don't leave it to the last minute. It's not an afterthought. It's an essential element of NEPA compliance, of getting a license. Sorry about that. And finally, we want to emphasize that compliance also contributes to the safety, the health, the welfare, and the quality of life in the local communities that public safety serves. It's completely consistent, or at least not incongruent, with the primary mission of public safety. And I think if you look at it that way, it's much easier to incorporate it into your plan, your overall plan, and to do it right up front from the beginning. We're going to begin our case study with a biggie, the state of Michigan and the Kirkland's Warbler. We want to illustrate that if you don't do this, it can be very costly in both terms of time, expense, especially time, you'll see. Michigan began to construct its 179 statewide system between 1996 and 2001. That's year 1 through 5. In 1998, they were contacted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to say that this could really impact some endangered species, including the Kirkland's Warbler. They had begun the process of constructing the towers without completing the process of assessing the towers' effects. This is a problem. I mean, you know, you don't start the construction before you think about the effects. You just can't do it. Okay, now we're getting in year 6 and 7. They've got some time invested in bringing themselves into compliance. It's ongoing. And of course, you know, lawyers are involved. This is getting expensive in addition to taking time. Year 7 through 9 is continuing to take time. You know, they're able to start bringing themselves into compliance. They're able to mitigate some of the damage by doing these studies to provide information that will be helpful in other sites. That's part of the way we mitigate damages, is by doing studies, by doing something, not necessarily to eliminate the damage or caused by a project. We're not trying to stop a project, we're just trying to make the best of the situation. Years 9 through 11, we're going and we're assessing the risk to the Kirkland's Warbler. They have to relight it. Again, it's an expense that could have been anticipated. And, you know, probably relighting is more expensive than fixing it to begin with, doing it right. Okay, we're in years 16 through 18. It's been going on a while, and we're starting to wrap up. Year 19, we're finally in compliance. Now stop and think about that. Children that were born when the project was begun are now they've graduated high school and they're starting college. This is, I can't guarantee that there wouldn't have been hiccups. I can't guarantee that there wouldn't have been unanticipated expenses in the process. I'm pretty certain it wouldn't have taken 19 years if they had started with this in mind. I'm pretty sure that it would have cost less money. I'm pretty sure that it would have resulted in fewer federal, state resources being expended. And that's going to be one of our #1 themes today. Start with the end in mind. I sound like Stephen Covey, but it's true. Proper preparation prevents poor performance. I mean, there's so many ways I can say this, but ultimately, you've got to start with this process in mind. I still can't believe 19 years, however. So that was nearly 2 decades, 3 federal agencies, significant federal and state resources, but the Kirkland's Warbler is making a comeback in Michigan. The project is working. The state is using it, and they are in compliance. And just in case you're wondering, that's what a Kirkland's Warbler looks like. So now we move to my home state of Florida, Pinellas County, near Clearwater. What we're going to try to illustrate here is how to incorporate, or how failure to incorporate, consideration of NEPA requirements into the planning process will result in rule violations. Gee. This is an interesting case because Pinellas County had already constructed the towers. The commission found out through a third party that the towers had been constructed. There had been no registration. This is not the way to begin a regulatory process or to build a good relationship with a regulatory agency. You know, we rely on self-reporting to a large degree, and we're going to discuss that in this process. One of the towers did qualify for exclusion from the historic preservation review process. Pinellas County decided that excluded them from the entire NEPA process. Not so. You've got to read the rules, and you need to read them critically. Not critical of the rules, but critical of your project. Don't try to, I said I was from Florida, I'm going to use a Florida term. Don't try to be a Philadelphia lawyer here. I mean, you really need to say, you know, how do I fit my project into this process? Don't try to get it out of it just to get out of it. You'll be well served by that. And I think that's another thing. Look at the rules critically and look at your project critically. And we get this a lot. Pinellas County suggested that because one of the towers was on land owned by the county and that there were no private or commercial co-locators, that they didn't have to comply. If you think about that for just a second, that's such a big loophole that it's almost absurd. And, you know, it also would defeat the purpose of NEPA. I mean, unless they're also going to build a big dome over it. You know, it's just, you need to, that's not going to get you out of it. And this is, again, what I'm thinking of in terms of look at your project critically. Try to figure out how it fits into this process, not try to worm your way out of the process. The process is not designed to prevent you from building this. It's just designed to air the issues and to minimize any damage or harms that might occur to other aspects of the environment. And I'm using an environment there with a lowercase e, just the surrounding area. Now we get into another issue. Pinellas County had incorrectly asserted that they didn't require the environmental assessment as part of their Form 8854. They hadn't looked at it. They hadn't made an attempt to determine whether an environmental assessment was required. So in doing this, they essentially, they had not made a good faith effort to provide us with proper facts. And federal agencies really rely on the veracity of reporting entities to know what's going on. You know, we don't typically send squads of people out to inspect these things. We simply don't have those kinds of resources. So, you know, we do ultimately frequently find out, and it's embarrassing for everybody when, you know, it turns out, no, you weren't correct. We do rely on your veracity. We are going to move on to Madison County now, Madison County, Indiana. And we're going to give an illustration of, and this is publicly available, the letter talking about what happens when we've determined that you've been in violation of our rules. This is especially interesting. I'm not sure about this particular case, but we sent a similar letter out to Pinellas County. In that case, the compliance had been, they had relied largely on a vendor, on consultant. But the person, the entity that was ultimately responsible was Pinellas County. So now they have this, I don't know that it's a huge blot, but I mean, in future things, we're going to be looking at them because we have determined they've been in violation. And, you know, if they're in violation again, there could be other penalties. So, again, Madison County had indicated the project would not have a significant environmental impact, and they, in doing this, they certified that they were true, complete, correct, and made in good faith. But they hadn't completed their historic preservation. You know, if you haven't completed the process, you can't make a determination that it's not an issue. You just can't. Public safety, that's my bureau, advised Madison County that it had failed to comply with our requirements. We also determined that they had violated the commission rules by constructing and operating from a public safety tower without first completing the historic preservation review. And finally, they were advised that future violations may result in additional action, including imposition of monetary penalties, and these can be pretty serious. We're not saying, again, the point of this is not to prevent the construction of a project. The point is to make sure that you've looked at everything, that the public has had an opportunity to make suggestions, to make criticisms, to, you know, minimize the impact on the community as a whole. Now we're going to, just so it's not a complete downer, we're going to move on to somebody who did it right. You know, so I get to put my happy face on now. And that's what we're looking at. This is the right way to do it. And again, I have my happy face. I'm going to give you a second to read that. The thing that this tells me is that the county, Albemarle, they took the time to read the requirements and to understand them. You know, you can't comply if you don't understand what the rules are, and you can't understand what the rules are until you've reviewed them. I know that sounds really basic, but it's true. And I think a lot of times when people find themselves in trouble, they haven't taken the time to figure things out. And we're going to get to resources in a few minutes, but one of the things I want to tell you right now, and I'll emphasize it later, we're here to help. And it's a lot more pleasant if we're all, you know, working towards bringing you into compliance to begin with than trying to bring you into compliance afterwards. And finally, I want to draw your attention to that third bullet. And I think that public safety agencies really need to consider that. It gave one of the important things here is giving the public the opportunity. This is the same public as in public safety, giving them the opportunity to provide input. And sometimes they come up with creative solutions. Sometimes they can be difficult, I'll admit that. But they do, you know, come up with things, and there are ways to accommodate everybody. And again, you know, the purpose is not to stop the construction of the project. It's just to make sure that everybody is heard and that all factors are considered. Not a lot to say about this, although it's important for you to be aware of it. There were two entities that objected. We ultimately dismissed those objections, or WTB did, the other bureau that we work with, and they granted the application. But as part of that, they had to go back or they entered into a memorandum of agreement with the FCC and the Virginia State Historic Preservation Office to mitigate the damage. And that's the way it's supposed to work. It's not to stop the project. It's not to just let the project go without any consideration of the overall environmental issues, all of the environmental issues. It's to build the project and do it so in a way that accommodates and acknowledges all of the other elements involved. Today, as far as I know, they're happily operating their structure, and all is well. And again, this is the way it's supposed to work. You know, going back to my initial comments about the Michigan project, you know, they had to do some things to jump through the hoops and to accommodate the historic preservation officers. That's the way it works. This was a very good application. Okay, now we're going to get to the reminders, because I'm going to hammer you guys a little bit, because there's only 3 or 4 real themes here. Number one, there is no public safety exception. I'm just, you know, we've been hit with that. We've also been hit with there should be. You know, I can't even address that, maybe over a beer. You know, it's just, this is the way it is. You have to do it. It doesn't matter if the proposed tower is on state, county, or locally owned land. It doesn't matter if there is no commercial co-locator on the site. It doesn't, well, there are advantages if it is a replacement tower, but it doesn't completely eliminate the need, and I'm sure Erica covered that in her presentation yesterday, the need for some consideration of the environment. And ultimately, I can't emphasize this enough, the licensee is responsible for compliance. If the licensee is using a third party to get this work done, that's great. There are a lot of, but ultimately the licensee is the one that's going to get the nasty gram from my bureau if they don't comply. Again, there's no replacement tower exception, except where there's a minimization of the historic preservation. The height of the tower does not determine whether a proposed tower is subject to the NEPA process. Some level of review is required. It just is. The antenna structure registration includes environmental notice, even without a EA. You know, I'm not going to read this all to you. You can take it home. And this is another issue. You can't just look at the instructions and the checklists. You've got to read the rules. You've also, I would highly recommend calling us. I mean, we can walk you through it. We can answer questions. But, you know, you've got to be forthright. You can't put it in the light most favorable to your project. You know, we've had that happen where somebody came in and they said, you know, well, this is our situation, but they left out something, you know, very germane. And, you know, ultimately we had to say, well, you forgot that, you know. So that's what I mean by looking at your project critically. And, gosh, I really thought it was going to take 45 minutes. I think we're all done. Are there any questions? Can I?
Ignore my scribble. Asking about a 10% height increase. It might be exempt from historical, but not NEPA. I would mention that. Okay?
Yeah.
One of the examples you used, it was the vendors growing up. Make sure licensees ask their vendors, are you considering NEPA? Just to.
Yeah, this is a good one. I'm not sure who brought this to our attention, but as a licensee, if you're a licensee, you may want to bring it up with specifically bring it up with your vendor. Are you covering NEPA? Don't just assume. We all know what assume means. You've got to cover this. That's basically as simple as I can put it. You've got to cover this. You've got to try to make sure that the vendor is doing what you think the vendor is doing. And we also have Yes, with a replacement tower, if it's under a 10% increase, you still need a NEPA versus the NEPA and historic tribal, the historic preservation and tribal review. Do you have anything that you wanted to add to that, Don?
It just also means, as
You-
you said, 10% and no expansion of existing compound.
Okay, oh, yeah. So if, the fenced area around it is increasing, there may be an issue. Is there anything else that I can? Okay, well, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to share these thoughts. I'd also like to thank my colleague Brian Marenko for fielding the questions for me. And I think we're ready to move on. Thanks.
Yes, hi.
It should be right there. Should be right there. Yeah.
Oh, good, is that power water
It's
being used?
slideshow. Yeah.
Is that a new power water?
Yes, it is.
Great, I'll use it. Good morning. I'm not used to sitting when I do presentations, so if my voice drops at all, please tell me to pick it up. I'm Claudia Wayne, and I work with the First Responder Network Authority in the Environmental Compliance Office. I'm the Environmental Justice Coordinator, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. I just want to ask a quick question of all of you. Who here is familiar with FirstNet? Okay, about half of you. And how many have been to a FirstNet briefing? Okay. Now I don't know how to go to the next one. How do I go to the next slide? Can you show me how to go to the next slide? I don't know what I did, but it went. So I would like to give you just a brief history of the First Responder Network Authority, also called FirstNet. Thank you. So that we're all on the same page and that you understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. After the 9/11 terrorist attack, there was a lot of evidence of what problems there were for emergency communication, police, fire, EMS, to be able to communicate with each other. There's 60,000 agencies in the country, and everybody's purchasing their own services, and often they don't work across services. So one of the one of the important findings was the emergency communication problems that needed to be addressed. So when the 9/11 Commission released their report, one of their recommendations was the need for a single nationwide network for public safety, so that there can be that interoperability and they can speak across agencies to what the needs are. Together, the public safety organizations, the police, fire, EMS, the National Governors Association, the mayors, many different groups came together and lobbied hard in Washington to get legislation creating a nationwide public safety broadband network. In 2012, the FirstNet was created by the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. In it, FirstNet was created, as I said, as an independent authority within the Department of Commerce's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. With that legislation, Congress also had in the act that FirstNet was to get 20 megahertz of what we consider prime 700 megahertz spectrum, and $7 billion towards building this nationwide network, which was a large amount of money, but GAO said it would probably cost $40 billion to build it. So the $7 billion was great, and we needed to come up with a self-sustaining model. So we first thought we were going to deploy a network ourselves, and then decided on engaging in a very robust, public, transparent procurement process to see who might have the most innovative ways to proceed for this deployment. And we awarded a contract to AT&T in March of 2017. And we have a public-private partnership with them now, and they are a contractor of FirstNet, and it's a 25-year contract. The spectrum we actually have for 10 years, and then we have to reapply to FCC that granted us the license to get the next 10 years, but the contract's for 25 years. So once we had the law, the law also made clear that that FirstNet was to have a core, which is the brains of any network, but each state was going to be able to choose whether to adopt our plan for what's called the radio access network, where they were going to place the towers, where the towers would be placed, what kind of communication was available in each state. And so each state had the option of either accepting FirstNet's plan, or they could opt out and develop their own plan that had to then go through a very rigorous review by FCC and NTIA to make sure that their plan was interoperable with the nationwide network and that it was sustainable. Ultimately, all 50 states and 6 territories decided to opt into FirstNet. So we were very happy that we're moving forward with one nationwide network where AT&T is setting up the RAN in each state. Now, one of the things that AT&T offered in their proposal, and which we accepted, was that any public safety entity that signed up for FirstNet would immediately have access to the entire commercial network of AT&T. And they would have priority and preemption on that network. In addition to that, AT&T is building out the band 14, that 700 megahertz for public safety. But having that immediately was very important, because a lot of times the issue is when there's a crisis, everybody's on their cell phone, and public safety was competing with every teenager, nothing against teenagers, but who might want to be live streaming what was happening, and public safety's situational awareness and ability to call on resources was greatly hampered. So having the priority and preemption was a critical piece for all of public safety agencies that have. Also, AT&T has now built that separate core, which from the very beginning we considered cybersecurity. And instead of security being an add-on after the fact, that was an integrated piece from the very beginning. It can always be improved upon, but from the very beginning, a focus was on how to ensure the security of the system, because police, fire, EMS were using that to share data across the network. They only share data with others that they want to share, but it's important to have that security. We already have more than 2,500 agencies which have signed up, and every month more agencies are signing up. Next year, we plan to expand further, and we're driving innovation in terms of technology for public safety, whether it's devices to Internet of Things, whether it's using drones in search and rescue missions, whether it's applications that are particularly tailored and tested by our labs to make sure they're secure. We consult regularly with public safety across the country to make sure that what we're doing is having their needs met, that we're relaying to AT&T what they need, how they need it in that development. As I said before, initially we thought that we were going to deploy our own network. So we developed implementing instructions and that we thought would work well. And we did, yesterday you heard about doing programmatic and environmental impact statements. I think that Erica talked to that yesterday a little. What we decided was to get ahead of the game. We developed the implementing instructions in 2014. Then we divided the country and territories into 5 regions, and we did an in-depth programmatic analysis of every state within the region, and we went and visited every state. We had 15 different resources we were looking at, which included threatened and endangered species, wetlands, visual impairment, airspace. We looked at everything, 15 of them. And we finalized those into early 2017 and issued a record of decision. As I said, AT&T, we awarded the contract to AT&T in March of 2017. And so we realized that our role was different, that we had this robust network, commercial network, that was going to provide the public safety build-out for us. And we decided that what made most sense then was to revise the implementing instructions so that we aligned closely with FCC. And I'll talk about that in a second, but I just want to say that if you go to, and it's on here, www.firstnet.gov, there's a search link right on there. And if you just put EPA in, you can get copies of all these documents. And as I said, they're extremely thorough. It'd be great if others use that as a starting point or in helping as they're doing theirs in their state. It's a lot of information that's very useful. So as I said, we wanted to align more closely with FCC. We found ourselves in a unique situation as an independent federal entity and a licensee of FCC. So we wanted to eliminate duplication of what was required by FCC and what was required by FirstNet. And you have to forgive me, I should say FirstNet Authority. Once we issued the contract and AT&T began deploying, FirstNet is often referred to as the network service that's available, and we're calling ourselves FirstNet Authority so that there can be a distinction. So we wanted to eliminate duplication. So we revised our implementing instructions. We follow the FCC agreement on colocation and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation program comments that are relevant. That has made the system more streamlined and not having 2 different sets of procedures that have to be followed. So what is happening now, a majority of the activities so far with AT&T have been co-locations, hanging a band 14 antenna on an already existing tower. So that becomes a categorical exemption. And what happens is they fill out the initial form. We review it to make sure that it's complete and accurate, and then they sign off on it and submit it. Excuse me. That has been working well. When it comes to any new towers, then it'll be necessary to do an EA, an environmental assessment, and either get a FONSI that you heard about yesterday, where there's not a significant impact, or do a more in-depth environmental impact statement. But that environmental impact statement can tier off of the in-depth programmatic environmental impact statement that we did. I should also say, if the categorical exclusions, like for others, if the co-location raises some issue that's extraordinary, that needs to be looked at. But mostly the co-locations are just categorically excluded, and we get the information to make sure it's not in a wetland, it's not a wildlife preserve, et cetera. We also are very aware of and follow the National Historic Preservation Act's compliance process, and have made sure that aligns with FCC also. And we have AT&T follow Section 106 and submit the form for the tower construction notification system that goes out to the tribal, the federally recognized tribes. I have to say, though, in addition to that, we have done a tremendous amount and will continue to do extensive outreach with the tribes. We have been meeting with them throughout the last 4 years. We have 3 people working full-time on that, one of whom, Andy Bielikowski, is the Federal Preservation Officer, and 2 other members of FirstNet staff that are doing full-time tribal outreach. So we've been meeting with the different tribes. We sent them a letter explaining what the process is. We're very aware of and respectful of the tribes being sovereign nations, and if they wish to consult with us directly, government to government, and not with AT&T, AT&T will notify us, and we will step in at that point. So we're making sure that that is happening in a way that is meeting what the tribes need. We haven't, right now, a lot of the focus, as I said, is on the co-location. There's 2 things that FirstNet does. It's increasing coverage, particularly rural and tribal areas, and increasing capacity. Increasing capacity is really important in urban areas, and that's being met with the co-location. We're looking to co-locate where we can, and then where we're needing to expand the network, that will be done. Do you have any questions? I do. Now let's see if I can read your writing.
I don't know if you can read my writing.
Can
Can you
you?
talk a bit more about environmental review processes for FirstNet projects and how you coordinate with FCC? Who reviews what in terms of CAT access or EAs?
Is that your question?
Yes. Can you read that?
Yep. Erica's asking whether or not, how we coordinate with FCC. We have an MOU with FCC to talk in terms of what our responsibilities are, what their responsibilities are. That might be revised in light of our aligning more closely at this point. We receive from AT&T the checklist form that they're going to submit to FCC with what it is, the co-location, what it's on. Is it on a tower? Is it on a water tower? Is it a utility tower? Give explanation, what exemptions are they following in terms of, is it pre or post March 2001? And then we look at that for accuracy and for completeness, and then send it back to them. They've signed it, they submit it. As to the EAs, the environmental analysis or the environmental impact statements, AT&T will be responsible for initially drafting the information and submitting it to us, and we will review that for accuracy and completeness. And if there's something that we don't agree with, we will have conversations with them and figure that out.
So do we review EAs for FirstNet towers, or do you?
What is your, what you're asking me?
Yeah. Are you, and there's another question.
With AT&T integrating FirstNet? The question is whether the Band 14 is separate from the overall tower site infrastructure. That's a great question, and I'm not an engineer, but to the best of my understanding, what's happening is that AT&T is co-locating on a tower that already has probably their equipment and their antenna, but also might have other network antennas on it. I'm not sure if that answers the question, and that was emailed, but we're not reviewing the entire tower. If it's making a significant change in the tower, such as raising the height by a certain amount or doing something like that, or there's too many towers in the area, then we have to look at that a little more closely. For the EAs that Erica is asking about, we have not yet received any of the draft EAs from AT&T. When we receive them, we will review them, and if we have edits, comments, we'll talk with AT&T and resolve those till we're satisfied with it, and then it'll be submitted. It's in then FCC's court how you handle that, so I'm not quite sure, Erica, what you're asking me.
We've gotten some EAs from FirstNet, and so I wonder if you review them first, or
EAs or categorical exclusions?
no, the NEA for FirstNet Tower.
I personally, as the environmental justice coordinator, was not aware of that, but I assume that any EA that you receive, we've reviewed and signed off on. That's my assumption, and if you want to give me more information later, I can check on that. Genevieve Walker is the Director of Environmental Compliance at FirstNet, and she is volunteering personally, not work, on a archaeological dig at Stonehenge. So she was unable to be here, otherwise she'd be here. And Amanda Pereira, who is the NEPA coordinator, was not able to be here. So, but if you send one of us that information, we can get that to you. But my assumption is that we would have reviewed it. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we're way ahead of schedule, since I was supposed to talk in a few minutes.
Thank you, Claudia. She's right that we are far advanced ahead of schedule, and so what we're proposing to do is to move up what was going to be panel number 5 at 12:40, making towers bird-friendly, and Joelle is going to make that presentation right now. And then for the rest of the schedule, we should still be on we should still be on track for our 1045 panel siting in floodplains and our 1215 ASR and broadcast tower issues. But as a result of this, I think we can probably get out about half an hour earlier than what's on the schedule right now.
Okay,
All
I'm
right,
just
I'll turn it
looking
over
for
to
my
Joelle.
presentation. So slides day 2, let's try that.
Should be the last one. They're over there.
I downloaded them all already.
Oh, good job. Oh, there they are. Thank you. Hi, how are you? Don't worry, we're not getting started without you.
Nice to see you.
I'm just bumping my talk up. Hi.
This is Jimmy Miller.
Nice to meet you. Hi. Nice to meet you.
Jim Goldwater.
You guys will be up after the break, so you
Yep.
happen to have a seat?
How's your son?
Great.
How's he liking school?
Loving it. Yeah, thanks for asking. We'll catch up. All right, so besides these nice people who just came in yesterday, was anyone not here yesterday? Okay, well, I expected a different audience, so we are going to be talking about some of the same things we talked about yesterday, but I will go into more depth, and hopefully you won't mind, because I'm talking about birds, and they're interesting. So we'll try to make it a little interesting and add some things that maybe we didn't get to yesterday as I rushed through. So the Michigan study that was referred to in our first presentation was actually the basis for these tower light changes that I mentioned yesterday. And so you will be able to hear, and I was hoping our FirstNet person stayed. Did she stay? Yes, excellent, good. So I would like you to hear some of this information about tower lighting, because I think it could be very applicable to the FirstNet system. I know it is. And so, so the Michigan study was actually alluded to or mentioned in that first presentation when we heard about the Kirkland Warbler and how the Michigan State Police built these towers, did not do environmental review on them beforehand, and then got stuck in this 19-year, I believe, project after that. And our speaker casually mentioned a kid could have been born and be in college by then. Well, that was my kid. I was actually growing a baby when they were building the towers, and he now just started college. So it's actually a true fact. And he has never known life without frozen birds in the freezer. And that's just how he grew up. And it's actually kind of relative to what we're talking about today, because you're hearing this for the second time. And when he was little, and I would go out and do presentations when I was working for Michigan State University and Central Michigan University, he would say, "You're going to talk to another bird group about towers? You just talked to a bird group yesterday or last week. When are they going to learn?" And he didn't understand they were different people all the time. Well, that kind of is relative to today, because you're hearing this a second time, but it's good to hear stuff a second time. And we'll, like I said, we'll try to add some additional things in here. And the FCC was, I mentioned yesterday that the FCC was not involved in that study. They were involved from a policy point of view and from a facilitation point of view, but Michigan State University and Central Michigan University, as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically Al Manville, who's since retired, and Paul Curlinger of Curry and Curlinger, they were involved in developing the study and helping it to go forward. They were co-authors on the publications that I wrote, and they were critical to that. And I was on the ground training the technicians, helping to design the study, and then picking up the dead birds and getting it published. So it was quite a team of many agencies, many organizations, had the support of both environmental groups and the tower industry, and that's where I was mentioning win-win-win. It really was. Everybody felt pretty good about that when it was done. So let's get back into this biology talk. a bit. As we mentioned yesterday, 4 to 50 million bird fatalities at towers annually in the U.S., with Travis Longcore et al. Refining that number to 6.6 million in the United States, another 0.2 million in Canada. They have a lot fewer, many fewer towers. And we talked about bird migration. These birds are migrating using stellar constellations of the magnetic fields of the Earth, polarization of the light, and all of this is in their DNA, that they are hatched knowing how to do this. It's pretty impressive. And I want to emphasize that these birds, when they're migrating, especially when we have inclement weather, so cloudy conditions, they may start off migrating and it's a clear night. And by the end of the night, maybe clouds have formed or fog has developed, and that's when these birds seem to be attracted into non-flashing lights. And as I mentioned, that can be stadium lights or building lights or anything illuminated. It's much like a moth to a porch light. And they become attracted into these steady burning lights. They start circling, and that's when we see the collisions with guy wires and possibly even the structure itself, and even possibly exhaustion just from simply flying around and around. So since we have extra time here, and you guys have seen this before, we can do a little bird quiz too. Anybody know what kind of bird that is? Miles? Anybody know what that is? That is a black-throated blue warbler. He's literally about the size of my thumb, and is quite a handsome guy. All right, and as far as the detected bird fatalities at these towers, we have, again, mainly songbirds. There's some species that are considered to be super colliders. Travis Longcore et al. Defined some of these species to be super colliders. They seem to be more likely to be attracted into these lights and collide with structures than other species with very similar biology. Super colliders in this slide would be, come on, Miles, you know that one. That is the ovenbird. The lower, it's also a warbler. They are called ovenbirds because they literally build a little oven-like nest on the forest floor and in the leaves and vegetation and lay their eggs and hatch their eggs under there. This guy over here is the red-eyed vireo. Whoops, let's go back. And this up here is the yellow warbler. Okay, so these are some of the species that are likely to collide with communications towers: vireos, warblers, thrushes, sparrows, some shorebirds, and waterfowl. We mentioned the Kirkland Warbler this morning, and that was the endangered species, not just protected by Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but the endangered species that was the kind of forced that study to occur in Michigan. Okay, and then we mentioned that towers with guy wires result in higher levels of avian fatalities than towers without guy wires, and we talked about these two sets of data down here on the left-hand side. Those towers with the taller bar and the hash marks, those towers have guy wires on them. The smaller bar, significantly fewer fatalities of birds. So fewer birds colliding with those structures or suffering fatalities at those structures simply because they lack guy wires. This bird in the lower right-hand corner is an indigo bunting underneath the tower. That is a bird fatality. And we... I wanted to mention that some subsequent research that I did when I was at Michigan State University, after we looked at guy wires versus non-guy towers and the actual bird carcasses, numbers of carcasses under the tower, we found a significant difference, but then we wanted to show that, or wanted to find out, we figured we knew the truth, but were these birds still attracted to the unguyed towers? Were they still circling in around the lights? And some acoustic data that we collected, which was documenting how many bird chip notes we heard at different types of towers. We documented that, yes, when I say we, I meant Michigan State University researchers. We documented that birds were circling around these unguyed towers. They just weren't colliding. So they were wasting that energy, which they should have been using for migration, which can lead to carryover effects, a lower reproduction the next year. So it can affect biology of these birds and their survival, but they weren't directly colliding with the structures due to the lack of guy wires. Still effective to build unguyed towers, but more effective to turn off your non-flashing lights. Okay, and Taller towers resulted in higher levels of bird fatalities than shorter towers. We believe scientists believe that this has a lot to do with the fact that the taller towers are literally up into the migration pathway of these birds. They're migrating at about 1,200 to 2,300 feet at night, and so those taller towers are in that level of migration, and they are closer to these migrating birds and probably easier to be attracted to those non-flashing lights during migration. And they also have higher surface area of guy wire. So basically more guy wire support on a taller tower. And I did want to point out that regarding public safety towers, you know, we generalize oftentimes in this industry that cell towers tend to be smaller, broadcast towers tend to be taller. The public safety towers can be in this middle group of towers. So the towers that we were studying in Michigan were about 450 feet tall. And that's tall by some standards, but it's short if you're a broadcast tower in the broadcast industry. So, but these towers were significantly high enough to be involved in bird fatalities compared to, you know, an 89-foot monopole or something like that. So the public safety towers do capture oftentimes this middle range of tower heights, which are involved in bird fatalities. And then the issue of lights. Steady burning lights on towers resulted in higher levels of avian fatalities than those lights that flashed. And we talked yesterday about how we had experimental design. This is true both at the tall towers, over 1,000 feet tall, that when you can extinguish those non-flashing lights, that you immediately, within 10 minutes, reduce bird attraction to the site. And we tested those on the Michigan State Police communication tower system and found that those tower lights that included a non-flashing light component were involved in significantly more avian fatalities. And by eliminating those non-flashing lights, we were able to reduce fatalities by up to 70%. And when you're thinking about 70% of 6.6 million birds, that's a lot of birds. But when many of these public safety systems were built, they did not have many options for building a system that lacks non-flashing lights. So we had a white light system, which was not popular with the neighbors, still isn't popular with the neighbors. And we also had a red light system, but every red light system included a non-flashing L810 component, which those are the ones attracting in the migratory birds. 2012, the FAA released a conspicuity study, so how conspicuous are towers that are marked without non-flashing lights, and the FAA, they released this study that determined that towers are able to be lit without non-flashing lights and still be safe for pilots, as long as there were enough levels of flashing lights. That came out in 2012. The FAA started allowing alterations to those towers, but then the official release of the advisory circular came out in December of 2015. And that was when the industry really started, I think, becoming more comfortable extinguishing those lights. We had quite a few before that turning off their steady burning lights, but it really became more acceptable after that, and the comfort level was higher. So now we have these new FAA lighting standards allowing tower owners to extinguish non-flashing lights on towers taller than 350 feet and to reprogram them to flash on towers 150 to 350. These new standards are applied to all new construction and encouraged for existing towers. And I want to emphasize they're available for new and existing towers. So this is an opportunity for many of these public safety systems that were built prior to 2015 to extinguish these non-flashing lights, thereby saving maintenance costs and energy costs, and for future construction, actually saving construction costs as well. It's a simple process to go through. And actually, I'm going to go back to this previous slide, seeing we have a little time there. A couple other things I wanted to emphasize, that there's no tower climbing involved in this. That's one thing that costs a lot of money and makes a lot of people uncomfortable, is putting people on towers, understandable. And there's usually not a need to do this. With communications towers and extinguishing your non-flashing lights, it usually can be done from the control room below, unless you are installing LED lights. And that would, of course, include some climbing. I wanted to emphasize again the option for ADLS, aircraft detection lighting systems, that I mentioned yesterday, which allows the system to not be lit until the radar detects an incoming aircraft. And at that time, the FAA lighting would illuminate. Let's see, I did want to clarify something with the first speaker when we were talking about when Michigan changed their lights after towards the end of that 19 years. That actually did not, it only cost them person power to go through the FAA process. As far as relamping the towers, that's one of the beautiful things about this, is it does, the towers that are taller than 350 feet do not need to be relamped. It's a simple switching of a switch. That's all. You're just turning off some lights. One guy said, one tower owner told me, you know, that going through the FAA process took 2 to 3 weeks. I had to get online to do it. Didn't really enjoy that. Then I had to update the FCC database. Wasn't so bad. He said the easiest part about it was going out to my tower and flipping the switch. He said that took me 6 seconds, and then I had to dismantle an alarm that told me the lights were not working. That took me another 7 seconds, and I was done. So for the Michigan State Police to bring their towers into a more bird-friendly system, it was really paperwork that probably took them the most time for that portion of the work. And after that, it was a matter of flipping the switch. They did not need to relamp those towers, unless the tower was 150 to 350 feet tall, and then they may have had to include some LED lighting systems on those towers. I did want to also point out, though, that the Michigan State Police did fund some tower lighting changes for the study. And that was a wonderful thing that they did. They literally worked on Saturdays to put new lights on some of their towers so that we could test them for bird collision issues. Okay, so this is an opportunity for FirstNet, and I hope she's still here, yay, good, I couldn't see you, to be able to consider some of the lighting on the towers that they'll be co-locating on. This is an opportunity for them to be looking at what are the lighting systems on these structures at this time. And as we're evaluating whether we're going to co-locate on these structures, maybe this is a good time to actually go through the small amount of effort to get FAA permission to extinguish those side marker lights on those structures that were constructed before 2015, December 2015. And I'm happy to help with that if you need any assistance or have any questions. So then moving on to the tower lighting process, I mentioned this yesterday. It's a fairly simple process. It's critically important that we go through the FAA to do this, though. It's not, I wish it was as easy as just turning off those lights, but it's not, because some towers, very few, but occasionally there's a situation where one of the towers has an antiquated lighting system that does not have enough levels of flashing L864s or flashing red lights. And that's a situation where we need to make sure the FAA is okay and comfortable with us extinguishing those non-flashing lights, making sure those towers are still well lit as an obstruction to aircraft. So that using 7460-1, the FAA form, it's online, and that's the first step of this process. It can take 2 to 3 weeks. If it takes any longer than that, please let me know, and I'm happy to reach out to the FAA to help them get over any hurdles they might have with their workload, et cetera, to get the process going. The next step is, once the FAA has approved this request and assigned an FAA study number, then to come through the FCC and file Form 854 via our antenna structure registration system. And then they would select a modification and choose the appropriate FAA lighting style. This is one of the easier steps of the 3. And if you have any problems with that, again, let me know and we can work through them. Once those lighting changes have been granted by the FAA and the FCC, then those L810 steady burning lights can be extinguished on towers taller than 350 and reprogrammed to flash in concert with the flashing L864 lights on those towers that are 150 to 350 feet above ground level. Rarely does it require tower climbing unless you're installing new lights for a tower that's shorter. And per the FAA requirements, the flashing red light should flash at 30 flashes per minute, plus or minus 3. So again, migratory birds. I also highly emphasize the request to use motion detector lighting on buildings if any lighting is required. Oftentimes, these buildings don't require any lighting for security. But when they do, motion sensor is commonly used, even without me asking, but it's nice to have that on there. The darker the system, the better, the less attraction to the site. And again, for towers taller than 450 feet, which does include many public safety towers, the FCC does require the preparation of environmental assessment that includes a section specifically addressing potential migratory bird impacts and your efforts to reduce those adverse effects, such as the building lights I mentioned. If bird flight diverters are going to be used, that's helpful as well. And I do appreciate seeking migratory bird comment from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And yesterday, and I believe today as well, on the side table we have best management practices, or BMPs, to reduce the effects of communications tower infrastructure development on migratory birds. And that includes things like timing your construction, minimizing the removal of vegetation, that type of thing. Make sure I covered everything. I believe I did. So does anyone have any questions about anything? Oh, and by the way, this is a Cape May warbler. When my son was little, it was his favorite because anything with a cape is cool. Yes?
Do we know why birds are attracted to them? Because I'm thinking, like, during the daylight, it's not like birds are flying to.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, they're not flying toward the sun. So why at night these kids are almost react like moths? Do you know why?
Yeah, scientists don't really understand what the... Oh, yes. The question was, do scientists understand why birds are attracted into lights? And we don't understand, as scientists, we haven't been able to determine, what they're thinking or why they're attracted into something. But it is very similar to a moth to a porch light in that they only during migration are these birds attracted. I should say, with these songbirds, only during migration are they attracted into lights. There are some species in Hawaii. If anyone works on towers in Hawaii, there are some birds that nest on land but spend most of their lives out on the water, sheer waters, is an example. And some of them are endangered. So it's a big deal in Hawaii to be very careful with any external lighting at night, because even during the breeding season, these birds are leaving their nesting site at night and flying out to the water. But lights just distract them, and they attract them, and then it leads to collisions. So as to why, scientists are not exactly sure. Scientists have found that exposure to red light does, and this is always, when the first time I heard it, I thought, what? This doesn't make sense. But there's a chemical relationship that is a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but I've read it enough and it's good science, that I understand it and believe it. But the exposure to red light chemically changes a bird's ability to use magnetic fields for navigation. So let me say that again. So if a bird is using magnetic fields for navigation, that's a chemical process in their eye and in their brain. And when they're exposed to red light, that their ability to use those magnetic fields is interrupted, or it's interfered with. So that is part of the situation, we believe, but we don't really know why beyond that. Good question. It's an interesting one. We do, scientists do know that certain colors of lights seem to be worse. Green light seems to be the best, according to some scientific researchers. And so some of the oil platforms out in the Gulf of Mexico, which I've been thinking about during these hurricanes, or the hurricane that came through recently, there are many oil platforms out there, and it's in a migration pathway for birds that come through our backyards, leaving the United States, crossing the Gulf of Mexico in one flight. They can't stop because they can't swim and they can't float. So they have to fly across the entire Gulf of Mexico to get to their wintering grounds in Mexico and Central and South America. And when they encounter oil platforms that are lit with white lights, oftentimes they're attracted in. And people have the job of sweeping these dead birds off the platform in the morning. And so the use of green lights at night on these facilities, according to science, has reduced the numbers of collisions, and it still is functional for the people working at the site. So there are some options, but red light seems to be the worst. Flashing light's the best. Any other questions? Thank you. And again, please contact me if you have any questions about this.
Thank you, Joelle, especially for pinch hitting on such short notice. A question came in for John Adams on the public safety and NEPA compliance panel after John had stopped talking. So we're going to bring John back up here to answer this, this very important question. I think after John is done, let's go ahead and take our break and meet back here at about 10:40.
The question was that as consultants, they have a responsibility to make sure that the FCC regulations are met. But if the tower owner refuses to do what we advise them to do, what are we supposed to do? We can't force them to perform an environmental review. I guess the first thing I would do is I would point out that we don't regulate the consultants, and you need to make them aware of that we regulate them. The second thing to do is to make sure that you document what you're telling the client, that you've advised them that they need to do it. And finally, you probably should advise them that in signing this, they have made a misrepresentation to a federal agency, and that is a federal offense. So this is pretty serious stuff, and that may get their attention. I don't know that you're necessarily obligated to bring it to our attention. We don't regulate the consultants, but we definitely regulate the tower owners. Okay? Any follow-up on that? Okay, thank you.
So I think we're done. Let's take a break.
Just in light of our recent rule changes that streamline the environmental process for siting facilities in floodplains.
We just get one on. We'll start from the beginning. We just, the webcast just.
Okay.
The
start
webcast?
here. There you go.
Okay, all right, let's try this again. Again, apologies for the delay, and we have a change in our panel, in that the FEMA person is unavailable. But we wanted to have a floodplain panel. We thought it would be useful, not just in light of our recent rule changes that streamline the environmental process for siting facilities in floodplains. That rule has generated lots of questions, and as you know, the rule change eliminated the requirement to do an EA if siting in a floodplain, as long as the facility and associated equipment are 1 foot above base flood elevation. With this panel, we're hoping to discuss the policy context around floodplains. To that end, we have Joelle talking about the ecological value of floodplains, why they're sensitive and significant from an environmental perspective, and why development in them is discouraged. We have Ted Bowling to my right, who is the representative from Council for Environmental Quality, the agency that oversees NEPA implementation. And we're hoping he'll discuss the federal policy around developing in floodplains and siting of infrastructure in particular. But maybe part of that was what FEMA was going to talk about. And we have Jimmy Miller, who's the president of Miller Company, and he will talk about best practices for siting in floodplains, so industry can best protect its investment while minimizing the ecological and fiscal cost of building in floodplains. And best practices also assure a resilient communications network in the face of floods and other natural disasters, which as you've probably noted, we've been seeing a lot of. So let's start with Joelle.
Thank you. So I'm very happy that Erica had the idea of having this panel, because we do receive quite a few questions about floodplains and what are the appropriate steps to take when hoping to site in a floodplain. So if we could go to the slides, that would be great. I'm just going to provide a quick overview of why we should care, basically. What are the value of floodplains and what are the challenge? I will be talking a little bit about some of the challenges of siting in a floodplain. Floodplains hold value for protecting us from floods and protecting our infrastructure. And we're not just protecting infrastructure, but also providing room for rivers to expand during floods, which then affects our water quality and other variables that I'll mention. So what is a floodplain? It's basically the areas around coastal zones and rivers. And when we have flood events or large hurricanes, large rain events, these rivers swell and the shorelines swell, and this is the buffer area between where we hope we are and the water body. So providing floodplains or allowing floodplains to be protected reduces the pressure on levees and dams while also providing erosion control. It improves water quality as floodplains act as a natural filter, removing excess sediment and nutrients. We're all familiar with seeing things settle out in a glass of water, or if anyone here is a hiker that pumps water to filter it. You don't go to where the river's rushing through because the sediments are all mixed. You go to the place where the water's had a chance to settle out, and you pump and filtrate your water from there. I don't know if anyone's a hiker, but it's a good advice. And that allows you to get the cleanest of the water, right? So that's one of the values of a floodplain, is to allow this area of the river or shoreline to expand upon a flood and allow some of these natural filters, removing excess sediment and nutrients. And it also decreases our water treatment costs. It recharges aquifers. By slowing the water flow, it allows time for water to seep into these aquifers, providing drinking and irrigation water. I think I used to teach basic biology, and I think we're something like, was it 98% water? I mean, water's critical to all of us. Floodplains also improve wildlife habitat and recreational opportunities. It provides a biologically rich and important area for fishing and migrating waterfowl, and for the hunters and fishers that use those resources. Provides opportunities for fishing, hunting, camping, hiking, wildlife watching, and boating. And as Erica mentioned, floodplains help us reduce flood insurance costs, and protecting floodplains help us reduce flood insurance costs and disaster recovery costs. It costs money to subsidize via flood insurance, and post-disaster damages can be very expensive. The U.S. spends an average of $3.1 billion a year on flood insurance premiums and $4 billion a year in crop insurance subsidies. So this is a serious matter. And while we're dealing with issues of hurricanes and some of those other natural disasters, those are the times when we need our infrastructure to communicate, our public safety systems, so that our police officers and other public safety people can communicate with one another. And so these infrastructure that are built in floodplains that are suffering damage during natural disasters, it's added danger. So at the FCC, feel free to contact Erica. I put her name first, and but you can contact either one of us if you have any questions or concerns about how to handle things with infrastructure development in floodplain areas. And with that, I believe we are going to hear from Ted, correct?
Right.
Okay. I do not have a slide deck, and I actually have a slide deck that I think Rachel might have spoken from. I'm going to try to do sort of dual duty, and I understand Rachel had a death in the family and therefore couldn't be with us here today. So I think it's up to me to try to stand in the gap and do an expanded version of sort of like the 8-step process that you use under Executive Order 11988. But just taking a step back from that. As probably some of you all are familiar with, we had an Executive Order 13690, which regarding establishing a federal flood risk management standard and a process for further soliciting and considering stakeholder input. It was the product of a fairly extensive interagency exercise in development, and it was issued by President Obama and with multiple or 3 possible pathways to addressing the issues of floodplain development. That executive order was withdrawn by President Trump in an executive order where, the withdrawal occupies just one sentence in the executive order, and it basically puts Executive Order 11988 back in place, which is one of the 3 approaches. And so it's not, hopefully not particularly disruptive to go back to the way things had been since the Carter administration. President Carter issued Executive Order 988 back in 1977. Required agencies to develop procedures for implementing it. So we're back, the way things were or the way things are. I'm at the Council on Environmental Quality. We're a small agency within the Executive Office of the President. We tend to get wired into all sorts of things like the recommissioning of the Federal Interagency Floodplain Management Task Force. I mention that because you want to watch this space. Right? What we're going to talk about today with Executive Order 11988 is the subject of further interagency work. So that President Trump's executive order represents a judgment that, Executive Order 13690 was too complex. It didn't get it right for various reasons. But for the protection of the values that Joelle discussed, for reasons of efficiency and interagency coordination, there is an ongoing examination of our floodplain management policy. And on the way in, I heard on NPR the damage from Hurricane Matthew is roughly calculated at about $25 billion right now, of which about $3 billion of that will be paid for by the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, that's, of course, event plus 2 days kind of calculation, subject to revision, maybe upward revision. But that does give you a sense of, we have a National Flood Insurance Program that Executive Order 11988 is designed to largely support, to ensure that federal agency decisions are not working at cross purposes to floodplain policy and the protection of floodplain values, that we are not, as a federal government, sort of contributing to the patterns of development and, reconstruction post-flood and both the environmental and economic consequences of improper siting in floodplains. So that's sort of the big policy picture of why do we have Executive Order 11988. Getting into the 8-step process, and I'm assuming I've got more than 20 minutes now, thanks to Rachel not being here. The Executive Order 11988 issued, May 24, 1977. It's fairly early on in the Carter administration, about the same time that CEQ was charged with developing the NEPA procedures, which you all know and love. it was paired with an executive order on wetlands management. And one of the first questions that came to CEQ, which CEQ addressed in a memorandum March 21st, 1978, which is still up on NEPA.gov, is, well, how do we reconcile these two? Largely, the answer to that is in agency procedures, and particularly working with FEMA on the actual application, because the floodplain management executive order was in furtherance of both NEPA, the Flood Insurance Program, and Flood Disaster Protection Act, and they all, and frankly, those are all designed to work together. The executive order charged every federal agency with, both providing leadership and carrying out the executive order. It has this statement that active floodplain management represents a sound business practice by reducing the risk of flood damage to properties, and because unwise floodplain development can lead to loss of life and natural resources, it is simply a bad federal investment and should be avoided. So, I mean, that message is as timely today as it was in 1978. I think anyone can say, well, floodplains are no longer an issue. It's like, some areas of environmental law where you can say, oh, I can't believe we used to do that, and we've moved beyond that, and environmental law has taken care of that. Floodplain policy would not be one of those areas. The challenge remains. The executive order's modality of making sure that the federal government is providing leadership in its decision-making that, ensures that we minimize the impact of human safety, health, and environment, minimize and reduce risk of loss of property, and restore and preserve the natural and beneficial floodplain values. That remains part of our challenge for our decision-making. The strategy adopted by the executive order is to avoid, to the extent possible, the long-term and short-term adverse impacts associated with inappropriate development, occupancy, and modification of floodplains, and to avoid supporting floodplain development whenever there's a practicable alternative. And that's probably the most important aspect for purposes of federal regulatory actions as opposed to actual development actions. So the executive order covers all agencies and all actions. It most directly applies to acquiring, managing, and disposing of federal lands, such as this facility, and I'll probably make a couple references to this. We are just outside the floodplain. I printed off the National Flood Hazard Layer FirstNet, the FEMA data product, which is very usable. I mean, even lawyers can pull up the GIS representation of the building that we're in, and we can see that we are here on 12th Street. So we're just outside the 500-year floodplain. There is what appears to be a wing of this building behind me that is in the 500-year floodplain. Presumably, it's built entirely in compliance with 11988 with necessary design features to ensure that we're not endangering critical infrastructure by locating it within the 500-year floodplain. That designation of the 500-year floodplain is the subject of some modifications to the base flood map. The blue on my, and I hope the folks who are looking online, it looks like I've got a good representation of it there. The blue there is basically the tidal basin, aptly named. I mean, the Potomac is tidal up to this point, and the 100-year floodplain, which that's theoretically 1% chance in any given year that we will have a flood up to that level. I think we've all, those of us who are DC residents, are familiar with this part of DC and say, yeah, it's about probably a 1% chance that your feet will get wet down there. I mean, we do have flooding that reaches up to Main Avenue. So this is an online representation of the realities of floodplain, and frankly, not all parts of the United States are mapped, and this is where, you know, it's you're using the contact us link on the FEMA website for the unmapped areas, but a great deal of the United States is mapped, and that represents a fairly significant advance. You know, like the executive orders that charge CEQ with creating NEPA, you know, they depend on interagency coordination. The executive order back in 1978 was talking about using HUD maps. Well, now they're FEMA maps. And at the time, you had a map book. Well, we've got it online now. And so we've got great efficiencies that we can make use of that could only have been dreamed of back during the Carter administration. But you know, if Rachel were here, she would encourage you to work with FEMA because they are charged with providing technical assistance and consultation to federal agencies on implementing the Executive Order 11988. It's in their interest because the FIMA portion of FEMA, the I is for insurance. They manage the floodplain insurance program, and so it's in their, you know, direct economic interest, if you will. It's programmatic for them to support that program. By the FEMA count, and I can't validate this, I did not go check 55 agencies, but that 55 agencies have developed implementing procedures in some form or fashion for Executive Order 11988. I suspect that they're probably counting FCC as part of that because there's reference to floodplains in
the executive order.
And the executive order within FCC procedures. And those were all developed in consultation with CEQ and FEMA. In that way, again, Executive Order 11988 looks a lot like NEPA, where, you know, NEPA procedures are developed in consultation with CEQ, where that's designed to try to ensure as much consistency as possible. The basic operation of Executive Order 11988 is, first of all, it's established this 100-year base flood as the minimum. That's the minimum standard for purposes of your concern. The executive order guidance also stipulates that critical actions should not be undertaken in any area subject to the 500-year flood. The intent is that we will hold the federal government and federal government agencies to no less than the standard that we require for National Flood Insurance Program communities, and that we're focused on property protection. It's primarily property, life, and floodplain values there. I think we're going to talk a little bit about critical actions, but I should just note that the critical actions are those actions for which even a slight chance of flooding would be too great, such as, you know, the location of hazardous waste facilities, hospitals, nursing homes, fire and police stations, critical records, those sorts of facilities that you don't want to locate in the floodplain. Under Section 3A of the order, it requires that the construction of federal structures and facilities shall, at a minimum, comply with the NFIP requirements. This is to, again, ensure that we hold ourselves to the standards of the executive order. Going through the 8-step process, which is my charge. And we just rattle them off. First, it's determine if the proposed action is in the floodplain. So we've got the FEMA maps. It should actually be relatively simple to say, okay, we know the location, and, you know, I've checked this in a couple different ways. You know, I found this by street address. You can also do it by GPS coordinates. You know, you can do it by latitude and longitude. You know, you can oftentimes determine, is that a yes or no, pretty quickly. If it's yes, then you move on to step 2, early public review. Step 3, identify and evaluate alternatives to locating it in the floodplain. So that's, you got to look at basically a no-action alternative in the floodplain or not in the floodplain. And even if you are outside the floodplain, you do have to have some inquiry as to, does the action have an impact in the floodplain or indirect support for floodplain development? So even if you're looking at alternatives that are on the periphery of the floodplain, okay, we're going to move it 50 feet out of the floodplain. Does it, as a practical matter, still affect the floodplain? The guidelines anticipated that the sort of like 50 feet, but as a practical matter, we're having those effects, the same effects on the floodplain. Step 4, identify impacts of the proposed action. Step 5, minimize the harm and restore and preserve natural and beneficial values. Step 6, you are going to reevaluate the alternatives. So you're looking at the alternatives, you figure out what are the effects of it, and then you take another look at it, you make your findings, your public explanation in step 7, and then step 8 is you're implementing the proposed action. So just to break those 8 steps down to a little finer detail. So assuming we're in step 1, we've gone through step 1, we are in step 2, we're in the floodplain. So providing for early public review. The objective there is to involve the public on, that may have an impact on the decision. So it's the immediate environs, looking for a vehicle for providing notice. This is basically a performance standard there. It's not very specific as to how do you involve the potentially affected public, and frankly, whatever is effective is likely to be compliant with the standard. The third, identify and evaluate practicable alternatives to locate in the floodplain. So as I said, practicable alternatives are capable of being done within existing constraints. Obviously, there's a fair amount of interaction with the proponent of the action to figure out what's capable of being done there. No action alternative is the facility needed at all? Do we really have to go here in the floodplain? And that may be an important consideration. For the FEMA perspective, they would suggest for your consideration that there may be actions where you might not want to do step 3 of considering alternatives before you go to step 2. In other words, you might want to, or you might want to actually combine the 2 steps and really sort of iterate with the affected actors. In step 4, identify the impacts of the proposed action if there's no practicable alternative. So this depends widely on what's the nature of the action and what's the nature of the impact. I mean, is it impacts to lives, property, or floodplain values? And are we talking about direct or indirect impacts? There's a judgment call there. And frankly, impacts goes both ways. I mean, there actually may be some positive impacts. We may actually be, consolidating things within a facility that otherwise are broadly dispersed or maybe even are vulnerable right now. We're addressing an existing vulnerability with improvements that help reduce the vulnerability to lives, property, to the natural resources. Assuming that we've got some negative impacts on the floodplain, then we're moving on to step 5, minimize, restore, preserve. If a proposed action will result in harms to the floodplain, I mean, and the minimization really cuts across. It's both in terms of lives and property, but then also, loss of habitat, the water quality functions that Joellen talked about, and then in step 6, well, so why do we do this reevaluation of alternatives? I mean, this seems a little bit of sort of, cyclical or redundant analysis? Well, it's important to, once you've done your analysis, to not become a prisoner of your analysis. Really just sort of step back and check, is this really still the only practicable alternative? Now that we've looked at alternatives, informing that. And then step 7, providing a statement of findings and public explanation of the proposed decision. That is in and of itself an important process. I mean, actually writing it down, stating, how do we get through this? It really is, proof of concept. And sometimes when you think you've thought through a problem and you write it all out, you find actually, there's some kind of holes in my logic or holes in my reasoning. In preparation for this, I pulled up real live, Army Corps of Engineers application of the 8-step process. Walking through each one, it's like, how do we determine that the action's located in the floodplain? Laying out the reasoning of notifying the public. Here's what we did. In this case, they sent out a draft A for a draft environmental assessment for public review. Step 3, we're walking through the practicable alternatives in a very concise way. I mean, look, I've got a 4-page document here. That's the sum of the EO 1198 analysis. But they lay out in just a sentence or two. Here are the alternatives we looked at. We've identified the potential direct and indirect effects associated with this floodplain development in the space of 2 paragraphs. A nice, concise document. There are practicability considerations, the reevaluation of the alternative, and in particular, they talk about the no action alternative. And, it's maybe I would have asked them for a little bit more discussion about how do we know that that's not practicable, but they're referencing back to the prior analysis, and they more or less sort of validated it. This sort of writing it down is important to the approach. And then there's implementing the proposed action. That's designed to ensure that, the action is carried out the way we've evaluated it, which is an important part of the process. I mean, this should not be just a paperwork exercise that bears no relationship to the on-the-ground reality, because, we own this problem of floodplain management. We're going to be coming back here, and other federal agencies are going to be coming back here to this map and looking at this, and they're going to go, wait a second, why did they do that? Why do we have this, critical facility here in the floodplain, 30 years after, 40 years after President Carter issued an executive order designed to avoid that? So we all own that problem, that result. In the interest of time, I see I've gone well over my allotted 20 minutes. Maybe I should.
Does that include Rachel's time too?
Well, I can go on. I'm subject to your direction, moderator. So go ahead and moderate me if you'd like, otherwise I could.
I think we have time. If there are other things you want to talk about, I guess I can suggest something.
Well, possibly talk about cell towers and whether they're critical actions. Yeah, well, let's do it.
You got it.
Okay, all right. So, I'll take the bait and say, so a critical action is any action for which there's, even a slight chance of flooding is too great. So that's, the 500-year flood. Now, if only we had that kind of predictive quality that we could say, oh yes, 500 years, sometime halfway through, in a time period that's double the life of this nation, we will have this flood event. As we all know, nature is unpredictable and perhaps becoming more so. And just because, floodplain maps worked out this way in the past doesn't mean that that's the way it will go in the future, particularly if you're talking about, say, coastal flooding. And so that warrants consideration. The fundamental question is what happens during that worst case? Will it create an added dimension to the disaster if this facility is flooded? Given the available flood warnings, would we be able to avoid loss of life or injury in that case? And would essential services become inoperable? We were talking, Erica and I were talking a little bit about, well, under what circumstances would, and I think maybe we'll open it up for further discussion, but I'll throw this out for Jimmy to maybe, take this ball and run with it. And it's like, I can imagine in some floodplains where, you've got good communications relationship between upland and floodplain, and the loss of a cell tower in the floodplain, well, you've got sufficient coverage, you've got sufficient redundancy. That's not a big consideration. That's not critical at that point. In another floodplain where it's floodplain for as far as the eye can see, and it's, if this cell tower goes down, well, they're all going down. That's a very different consideration. But that's where the site-specific application of 11988 is important. That's where documenting our reasoning is important. Is like, how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? How do we separate those critical situations from the run-of-the-mill? This is not a concern, and we're just documenting why it's not a concern. I think that's the critical question for us today.
It is, and I don't know, in that last scenario, do you deem it critical and therefore it should not be built there, or you deem it critical and it should be built because it affects communications networks broadly? Or do you build it in a certain way?
I think it's probably more the latter. I mean, it's first of all, is it practicable to avoid, the no action, to avoid the floodplain? If it's not practicable to avoid the floodplain, then how do you design for that event? Elevation is the remedy adopted by FCC earlier this year, and that becomes an engineering consideration of, okay, so how well does that work?
And that's a perfect segue into
There we
my
go.
presentation. Thank you, Ted.
Excellent. All right.
On to you, Jimmy.
Okay, Jimmy, you have the floor.
Help you with your slides here.
All right, thank you. My name's Jimmy Miller. I own and operate a tower maintenance company in South Mississippi. I'm also representing the National Association of Tower Erectors, which is an association with about 850 member companies. And we basically build and maintain the wireless infrastructure across the nation. That's what our members do. So, pleasure to be here. Thank you. As Ted alluded to, building in floodplains, I think I've got some, it's perfect. I appreciate that. Perfect segue into my presentation. Okay. Before I go into the details of the construction and what's elevated and everything else, I want to talk a minute about what are the drivers for a cell site to be built in a floodplain. I will tell you, it's not the desire of anybody to build in a floodplain. It adds cost. Logistics are more difficult. Maintenance is more difficult. Some of these sites, even after they're built, you may have to service with a boat. So it's not, definitely not number one choice. The desired siting of a cell site of choice is high ground, next to a highway, dense soil, and dark fiber optic cable nearby. That's the perfect cell site. This is not it. This particular site I'm talking about here, I actually constructed this site in 1990. It's down in South Mississippi. And what were the drivers? What forced us to go build in the middle of a floodplain? And the first one was, what's our objective here? This particular site was built for electric utility, so the objective was at a certain frequency RF coverage over their substations, their transmission and distribution lines, their customers, so that they could adequately run their fleet of bucket trucks, data, we call it SCADA at the time. That's an old term, but so that was the driver. Where can we get RF coverage as a function of our frequency license, right? So those were the drivers for doing that. Next to that was zoning, of course. We have to comply with zoning. That particular tower right there is about 480 feet tall, which led us to nearby airports. That was another criteria. FAA limitations. So when all those parameters were put into the algorithm, this was the only place we could build to meet all those requirements. Next slide, please. All right. This is another example of an elevated site in a floodplain. This particular site happens to be about 200 yards away from the one on the previous slide. What's interesting about this, as you'll note, is this site was built much lower than the previous slide. This site was built about 10 years earlier. So the floodplain predictions at that time were this, as compared to 10 years later, they're 10 feet higher. Again, we're on the coast of Mississippi. A lot of hurricanes come through. You know, and they're getting worse, obviously. Tidal surges and everything else. So that's what I wanted to point out on this one, is that the elevation is about half of what you saw previously. Next slide, please. This is an example of a multi-tenant cell site. It's adjacent to a river. Same game. Why? There has to be a better place to build this site. You know, what forced all this extra construction to place it here? And again, it was the same drivers. It was airports, it was zoning, it was coverage, et cetera, et cetera. This particular slide is this site was constructed post-Hurricane Katrina in Biloxi, Mississippi, where previously, this is an example of the floodplain changes, all the wireless equipment was about 2 feet off the ground. Every major cellular carrier in the nation happens to be on this particular site. So after Hurricane Katrina, there was a tremendous amount of infrastructure equipment lost, as you can imagine. So in addition to, you know, zoning and rebuilds, everything was placed much higher to add reliability, obviously, disaster, cost, et cetera. So as Ted mentioned earlier about areas where there is large amounts of floodplains, I think a perfect example of that would have to be the Louisiana Bayou. So there are many, many cases where there is no choice but to build in a floodplain, just due to the geographic nature of South Louisiana, right? This particular slide, there's many things to talk about, but we have a extremely heavy and large equipment shelter elevated approximately 15 feet, could be 15 to 20 feet. And if you notice, they use concrete pilings and construction to accomplish that. I have more on this. Same site, gives you a great shot of the marsh. This one is showing the electrical facilities as they are elevated using a different construction method. But it does show that the service entrance equipment, the termination of the electricity is above the floodplain as well. There's a couple of key things in this slide about elevation. Obviously, you can see the shelter that's elevated. You can see a platform to the left that has some equipment, and obviously there's room for more equipment. This one doesn't show it. I have other slides to show more. If you notice, all the electrical, all the telecommunication facilities, all the backhaul facilities, everything necessary to run this cell site is off the ground, elevated on these facilities. What I'm trying to show you in this slide is there was a combination of steel, there was a combination of concrete. The electrical was obviously put on wood, just to show how we accomplish multi-tenants on a cell site, elevated in a floodplain. And what the slides don't show is that all of this is within the confounds of like a 60 by 60 square. It's in there tight. Obviously, that's less damage we do to the environment. So there's no wasted space is what I'm trying to say. It's all in there pretty tight. In this slide, those black lines running from the tower on the right into the shelter on the left, those are all the coaxial cables, or you could consider them pipes, if you will, for the RF to go from the top of the tower into the equipment. And you can see the elevated electrical on the wooden platform in the back of the slide. This is kind of a snapshot of the whole site where you can see the marsh in the background, the monopole, the platform to the right constructed out of steel. Kind of gives you a big picture of the whole site. And again, this is a back view of the site showing the actual monopole itself, the elevated coax, and part of the shelter. One more. So, what do we need to elevate? Obviously, we want to elevate the electricity into the site. Granted, that's probably going to go away. We're looking at in the wake of this storm that hit Panama City, so we know that's probably one of the first things that's going to fail. The generator is also elevated. Backup power source, which is fully automatic. Backup power fuel is elevated, right? You got to power the generator. Obviously, the carrier's equipment, the actual equipment that processes your call and your data, is elevated, and the means of backhauling it, back to the central office or central switch, as we used to call it, is also elevated. In many cases, the FAA lighting system is elevated. Again, it's an electronic component. It gets wet, it's not going to work. So that's another thing that's elevated. And as Ted already pointed out, most of the local jurisdictions that determine the height that all this stuff must be elevated is easily obtained from the FEMA maps. I will say that most of the construction practices exceed that, strictly due to the cost of building a new site and protection of their equipment. I'll open it up to any questions. Yeah. If anybody has it this time.
Well, I have one.
Okay.
Is there any elevation of the tower? And if there is it different from the pole elevation? Can you elevate a tower, or do you design it differently when it's in a floodplain to strengthen it, or?
That is a good question. There are some rare cases in which the actual foundation is built up, but for the most part, the tower can be built at ground level. Obviously, that's engineered into the foundation of the tower through the geotechnical report. We know before we go in there what we're dealing with. So it can be built at ground level in accordance to EIA/TIA standards, wind loading, ice, and those particular wet soil conditions. So it can be built at ground level. And if you noticed that in my slides, the monopole was actually built pretty much at ground level.
Right.
Yeah.
I did. Thank you.
If I could, just, a related question. So I imagine, you're constructing in, alluvium, or you're constructing in wetland soils, that sort of thing. And if you're in coastal Louisiana, which is, eroding at a rate of like a football field a day, how do you take those engineering considerations, and how do those play out in the development of the site? I'm thinking about just like the degree of, how much rock are you bringing in, and just how far down do you dig, and so how much of a foundation do you make within the floodplain?
It can be huge. The first thing that's done is the soil is bored to a depth that will tell us, that will yield the results of the amount of foundation that is going to be required to support this structure, given the wind loading and ice loading of that geographic area. So there's a whole lot of people smarter than me to come up with that, I'll tell you that. But that's how it's done.
And flood effects too, or just wind?
The soil conditions can affect it, and that's the whole premise of the geotechnical study survey. But the majority of obviously it has to support the wind and the ice for a given area, and obviously along the coastline. Again, we're in the wake of a hurricane, right? Any new structures are built for that wind loading requirement. So as far as what you talked about, the erosion in Louisiana, I'm not so sure that a cell site would be built on such an edge of erosion. I don't see that as being practical.
Just as a means of protecting the investment.
That's correct.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to ask if, do you have any statistics or estimates regarding the performance of wireless services on elevated tower facilities during hurricanes, tropical storms, storm surges, et cetera?
I'll take a shot at that. Having lived through Hurricane Katrina, South Mississippi became a telecommunications island, and it wasn't just because of cell sites. There were numerous fiber optic cables by many of the major landline carriers that were severed. It was difficult at best to get out. However, there were systems, and I'm proud to say the one I built in 1992, I made the slide of, was one of them, where the infrastructure worked. Everything worked. The backup power worked. The backhaul worked. We had fuel. All that worked, and calls were able to be placed. As far as raw statistics, I'm not sure I have that data, but.
Thank you.
Was there an engineering and maybe insurance reassessment post-Katrina that you've seen impact your work? And some modification of design standards, engineering standards, that sort of thing that learned from that experience, where for the facilities that you didn't build and that failed?
Oh, you bet. I think I may be speaking out of context here, but there was actually some government-issued requirements in terms of backup power and more redundancy in such situations. But yes, you bet. Lots of lessons learned in terms of backup power. Also in terms of the network topology, such that if you had made mention that you could lose one or many cell sites, and in the event that one should fail in a floodplain, while that is possible, with the network topology we have today and the redundancy that can be built into the backhaul, multiple paths to get that traffic back was another big lesson learned after some storms, such that you're not in series, so if you lose the head of the chain, you lose everything down the chain. You're more of in a, let's say, a ring or mesh topology where the traffic can get back through multiple ways.
Okay.
Once constructed, if it's not constructed up to floodplain standards, which you'd expect in a floodplain, are there ways to accommodate for floods? If, do you know what I'm saying? If it's not built properly the first time, are there things you can do? Can you flood-proof a structure? Can you raise it once it's built? We run into that once in a while and get those questions.
You can. It's more costly, obviously, to come back, take something apart, pick it up, put it back down, and keep it on the air at the same time, right? As compared to being smart and building it that way to begin with. However, we all know the flood zones are changing, right? So it is becoming more and more prominent for that to happen. So, but it is, it requires a great deal of planning. It does add, obviously, more cost than if you had planned for it, but it can be done, yes.
Ted, I have one for you. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this. Our rules refer to elevation above base flood elevation, which is
Right.
different from elevation over the floodplain. Are there,
Right, it's within the floodplain.
it's above?
Yeah,
Right.
yes, exactly.
So are there maps, or how does one readily figure out BFE as opposed to if one's in a floodplain?
Right, right. So it's a function of how high do you go, not, how far horizontally do you go to get out of the floodplain. So, and I'm really sorry that Rachel Sears is not here to answer the question, but I'll do my best. And that is if you look at, I mean, this is primarily an engineering consideration, but if you look at the FEMA flood maps, I mean, they've also got these gradations on there. So, it's actually like the 12-foot elevation of the Potomac River and the 11-foot elevation of the Potomac River. It's the flow of the Potomac River is mapped on here as well, so that from this, as well as you can from the topography as to where do we stand on, and then at what elevation do we need to go to get ourselves as though we were moving it out of the floodplain? How high do we need to go? You can calculate that, at least from this map. As I said, not all parts of the country are mapped. I mean, that's the engineers, the folks who are doing the survey, they ought to be, not just figuring out where are we on the map, but also what is our elevation, and sort of how deep in the floodplain are we, in terms of ascertaining how high do we need to go to meet engineering standards that get us to an area of safety. How high do these concrete pillars that we're going to construct need to be? That's so that I trust that that's the way it works.
Okay. And for areas that are unmapped, do states do flood zone mapping, or locals, or what is best available data if FEMA maps are?
It's my
not-
understanding that there are local maps and that's
Okay.
that's done as a matter
That's
of
correct.
yes.
Local meaning state or
county.
So we look to the counties.
Yeah.
for those.
Yeah, but then again, FEMA, please contact FEMA. Do not say Ted said, but please, please contact FEMA. That's why they're there, is to help help work through those site-specific technical issues. And if you're doing it in Alaska, I mean, I'm sure it's a much more complex because we're still completing the USGS topographical maps for much of Alaska. So, that we have trouble flying around mountains in Alaska, much less figuring out where the floodplain is. But there is a rough level of floodplain mapping there too.
Thank you. Okay, I got a couple of questions, which I will attempt to answer. Could you please clarify what the FCC would need to see in an EA for a project located within a 100-year flood zone, but that will not be elevated above the base flood elevation? Prior to the second R&O, showings that the facility would be elevated and the building permit was enough, but going forward, will simply providing the permit or evidence that no permit is required be sufficient, or will there be other requirements? I can say whoever wrote this would be the first person submitting a floodplain EA post-report and order. So I can say I'm not sure. We'll have to look at it more carefully when it comes before us. But this does lead me to another question about building permits, and some areas do not have zoning and do not require building permits, so what do you use as your basis for constructing in a floodplain? You just, your own engineering standards and?
That is correct. As far as locations that have no zoning or have no permitting, the same methodologies used in places that do are used. Obviously, these people are spending a lot of money to put this infrastructure on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an automatic vested interest to protect it. And so it's going to meet or exceed any county or city zoning, especially in the areas that don't have it at all.
Okay.
Right, so it's.
Thank you.
And I'll just add, I mean, my sense of it is like so much in environmental assessments is just, show your work.
Mm-hmm.
It's explain your reasoning. And so, citing to those underlying documents about, here's how we know that we've moved it out of the floodplain. And then, as I noted on the step 3 evaluation, even if you're out of the floodplain, you still need to look at, are we going to have indirect effects on the floodplain? And that, if you're talking about just elevating above the floodplain, then, well, the indirect effects is everything that's below that gets you above, as in, all the engineering work that went into, building the facility up out of the floodplain. What are the effects of that? How do we know that this is effectively avoiding the concerns that are really at the heart of Executive Order 119880? And that, we're not, we've not just sort of engineered our way into yet another problem. We've actually engineered to avoid the problem.
Similar to that, we received an online question for Ted. Are there restrictions on altering the floodplain as we build a site up above the floodplain? And could you expand on that, please?
Well, that gets back to the larger purposes of we want to make sure that floodplains have their own integrity. In other words, that we're not impairing the function of the floodplain. I think that's probably primarily a concern for things like Corps of Engineers water resources projects, where you're having such a large footprint that you could actually have that impact on the floodplain. I mean, certainly with regard to levee projects, we hear that all the time, where it's you've elevated the levee here and you're just pushing the water across the river to this community. We certainly see that all up and down the Mississippi River. In a cell tower context, I mean, it's my general sense that we're probably talking about a small enough footprint that the larger displacement effects throughout the floodplain may not be a concern, but frankly, that's an engineering, that's the engineering and assessment consideration. You can imagine, say like a dissected, a fairly narrow canyon, fairly narrow floodplain, and sure, yeah, you could engineer the heck out of it and raise it up there, but if we have a 500-year flood event, where's the water going? I mean, are we just going to have just that much more impact? Are we going to be having scour effects down adjacent to the facility in the canyon? that are, become then a consideration. So, I mean, it's very site-specific analysis, and I'm frankly, and I'm just a lawyer, so I can just sort of read and appreciate it.
I have one more question. Do you have others?
I do not.
From Miles. In the Q&As on the second report in order, we saw that poles were specifically excluded from the 1-foot base flood elevation rule. Can you define what facility includes for a tower installation? Well, we consider facility very broadly to include equipment, shelters, trenching, power sources, anchor points. So I'm going to pass this on to Jimmy to describe what makes sense to elevate.
Read the question again.
It's can you define what facility includes for a tower installation, I guess with the idea that, like, which aspects of the facility must be elevated. So I think in your final slide, you listed
Yeah, your key components,
a few items or components of the facility that should be elevated, but are there others? Or is that basically what is the standard practice? What is the best practice? You said that towers themselves were
Okay.
structurally designed but not elevated.
Right. Okay. All right, so let me try this again. The actual structure itself is typically designed such that it can exist at or near ground level. I can't say that categorically 100% of the time. For the most part, that's how it's designed, as a function of the study of the dirt, so to speak, and the potential loading that the structure could possibly incur. The key components of let's just call it a keep alive situation, keep the data flowing, right? Keep the calls coming, keep the data flowing, would be electrical, the backhaul means, which could be microwave, fiber optic cables, or still even copper cable telephone pairs. The backup power source, which would be the generator, obviously it's going to be elevated. The fuel for such generator, optionally, but a lot of people do it just due to the sheer cost of replacement, is the other components such as a tower lighting system. There may be some additional cabinets that support supervisory alarms or some other kind of monitoring, or satellites or stuff like that. You would typically see elevated, again, such that it could work when everything else does. You have to understand, especially now with FirstNet, existing radio systems, a lot of this is all about our first responders. So when everything else is broke, this stuff's got to work, right? So.
I have another question for Ted regarding maps. Typically, unmapped areas are not in floodplains. That is, that FEMA maps are not developed for areas not in dangers of flooding, right?
I think, that's the way the FEMA priorities have worked. I mean, and logically, I mean, they want to get good maps for the places of highest concern. So, and, I mean, the mapping is fairly broad. I mean, I live 100 feet above the Potomac River, and but within my zip code, there are areas that are flood prone, and I get FEMA notices about, do you have flood insurance? And I'm like, I know that you're making sure you're doing a reasonably broad swath to make sure that you're not ignoring areas just to focus on the targeted risk. But yes, places that are high and dry, that's not a big FEMA concern. So that becomes I think probably a confirmation to FEMA. It's like, so you've not mapped this, and it looks like it's not a concern. Can you confirm? So.
Are you suggesting that applicants should confirm with you if an area is not mapped? They should still confirm with you that it is indeed not in a flood.
They should confirm with FEMA.
Yes, with FEMA.
Not me. Yeah.
You don't want all those calls?
Oh, no.
And then possibly to the county if needed.
Yeah. I mean, local engineering consideration. Yeah.
Thank you. Is that it?
That's it.
That's it? Well, I want to thank the panelists for coming all this way.
Thank you for
from
inviting me.
across town.
Yeah,
And sharing your expertise and knowledge. We really appreciate it.
it's a real
So,
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I wanted to echo Erica's comment about our outside
forcing me
guests,
to actually
particularly
focus
Jimmy.
on
I thought that the examples you were providing were really interesting, and it was useful to just have that perspective from an outside industry level. Our next and final panel for the day is on antenna structure registration and broadcast towers. We're going to have two panelists. The first is Jennifer Flynn, an attorney in the Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division. Second is Mike Wagner, Assistant Division Chief in the Media Bureau. Jennifer Flynn is our subject matter expert for ASR matters. If you've ever had an ASR issue or question, chances are pretty good that you were dealing with Jennifer and Mike Wagner, because a lot of these media broadcast towers tend to be high. He's often involved in these ASR matters as well.
So I just click it. Okay, that works. Hi. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Flynn, as you just heard. If you've called about an antenna structure registration or pleadings or public notices, you have probably talked or emailed with me. The good news is this year there are no big changes to ASR. What I'm going to go over today is basically the system as it is. We do get a steady enough flow of questions that we thought this might be worthwhile. So the first thing you need to know is, what is antenna structure registration? What is its purpose? And its purpose is essentially air safety. So that, no, I'm not Joelle, as much as I might like to be. ASR has to be completed before you before you begin construction on a tower if ASR is required. You'll know when you're done because you won't have a file number that starts with an A anymore for application. You will have a number that is a registration number that is pure digits. And ASR, to go back, is for air safety, so that pilots know the towers are there and that they are lit properly so that the pilots can see them if necessary. Environmental notification came as a result of a 2011 remand order regarding public comment. Now what we do is, if you have a new proposed tower, we want to give the public an opportunity to comment on it before we go ahead and grant the registration. This whole process is codified at 47 CFR section 17.4C. And this process applies to new tower applications and for certain applications for modifications of existing registrations. An overview of the environmental notification process starts with the FCC Form 854. It's the application, all the information in the ASR application, plus a national notice date. And that is the date on which the applicant is saying, we are ready for this to go on national public notice on the Commission's website. The next step is, if we receive a request for further environmental processing during that 30-day comment period, we would go through a pleading cycle, which I will get to more later. And then after the pleadings are resolved, all the timing is completed, you can go to the Part 2 certification, where you can certify, or you must certify, that the proposed tower will have no significant environmental effects, and you choose the reason why that is the case. There are exceptions to the environmental notification process. They are listed primarily in 47 CFR section 17.4C1. They are things like notification only, we've had a change in ownership, we need to update our contact information, things like that. A reduction of the tower size or an increase in height that we don't consider substantial under our rules, and I'll get more to that later. The removal of lighting from the tower altogether, or the changing of lighting from a less preferred to a more preferred style. A replacement tower meeting certain criteria, a federal agency exception, and some temporary towers. I also get a number of waiver requests based on an emergency. And our general understanding of what constitutes an emergency is something that is neither avoidable nor unforeseeable. Just not getting it done in time when you had the opportunity is generally not going to make it.
And even if we do grant an emergency waiver in these cases, we will often require post-construction or post-authorization public notice. So we may let you go ahead and build right away, but you're still going to have to complete the notice process even afterward. Oh, I'm sorry, did I? So one of the exceptions was a substantial increase in tower height. There's a more detailed explanation in our rules, but generally it is no more than 20 feet or 10% of the underlying tower height, and it's the greater of those two. And we go by the structure height plus appurtenances to measure that, if you have appurtenances. For lighting styles, for more and less preferred lighting styles, no lights is most preferred. No steady red lights is the next most preferred, and our least preferred is red steady. You've probably heard Joelle talk about the effects on birds, and that's where that comes from. The replacement tower criteria, it's not just any replacement tower. It has to meet the requirements that you see up on the screen, being in the same geographic area, not require an EA, not use less preferred lighting, not involve a substantial increase in height, and not involve much construction or excavation, generally not more than 30 feet beyond the original antenna structure property. When you're submitting a waiver request for this type of exception, it is really helpful if you put in the waiver request that you meet each of these criteria and how, like you show, our tower is only going to be, our replacement tower is only going to be X feet high. It's not a substantial increase. The more detail you can put in there, the faster it is for someone to grant it. There are a few other, elements that could cause a substantial increase in height beyond just the 10% or 20 feet. You can see it at the bottom of the slide here involving the number of new equipment cabinets and width, but those are usually not an issue. We have the federal agency exception, and that is codified in 17.4 C14. This usually works one of two ways. Either you have a tower that's going to be built on federal land, and the land-holding agency takes responsibility for the NEPA process. Usually, you show that to us via providing an EA and a FONSI from that agency. The other way that can happen is if there is a written agreement with the commission, which happens from time to time. The temporary tower exception, we see quite a few of these. We also have some instances where applicants don't apply ahead of time because they don't think there's going to be lighting, and then there is. So just be clear that a temporary tower exception, if there's lighting, it's not going to make this exception. It's got to be in place for no more than 60 days, require notice of construction to the FAA, no marking or lighting, and be less than 200 feet above ground level, and involve no excavation or only minimal excavation. We also do not permit back-to-back temporary tower authorizations in the same service area. This is to avoid people trying to get beyond the 60-day limitation by filing back-to-back applications. So an ASR application, let's say you have a new tower, it doesn't fit any of the exceptions to the rule, and you have to go through the environmental notification process. The first thing you do is essentially fill out Form 854. That is the information that goes on national public notice. The other elements that you are required up front in this process are the national notice date, so we know when to start the process, and whether or not you're going to be including an EA. Just as a heads up, if you initially do not include an EA and then later determine that one is required and attach it, that will restart the 30-day process. I get a lot of questions about whether the FAA no hazard determination or study number are required to initially file the application, and it is not. It is required before the application can be granted, but it's not required up front. However, and this is where some applicants get caught up, the lighting description in the local and national public notice have to be right. So if you're guessing before you get the FAA's response and you turn out to be wrong, you may have to redo the public notice process because the lighting was not properly described. And also, there's no granting of an ASR application without that FAA number. The timing. So a national notice date is required as soon as you file your ASR application that doesn't have an exception to these rules. You can pick any date in the future as soon as the next day. You can also go in and change it to any day in the future. So let's say I filed an application today and I chose tomorrow to be the national public notice date, and then I found out that my local public notice wasn't ready. I could go in and change it again next week to a future date. You just can't backdate it. The one thing we require, though, is that please understand that the whole pleading cycle, if we were to receive a request for further environmental review, is based on that national notice date. That starts the timing for everything. So if you, let's say you start today and you say, I'm not going to be ready till December, and you pick a date out in December for your national notice date, and then next week you realize things are coming in earlier, you'll have it together, and you come back and you pick tomorrow. You need to let us and any parties, if anybody's already made a request, know about that, because obviously that affects all of us. The national notice, as I said before, basically provides interested persons with all the information in your ASR application. And I have the link up there for the applications on environmental notice that can be found on our website. The local public notice timing is one thing that does trip up some applicants. The thing to remember is that national notice cannot precede local public notice. The national notice can be on the same day or it can be after, but it cannot come before. And if an error is made in that, generally you have to start all over again with the notice. The general understanding behind that is that if the national notice precedes the local notice, anybody trying to comment based on the local notice may be shorted some of the days of the comment period. Local public notice, the content is generally the ASR application number, a physical description of the tower, including we call it the anticipated lighting. Again, it has to be right in the end. A statement that interested persons may raise environmental concerns and how. A statement that we strongly encourage parties to file requests for environmental review online, and the mailing address for interested parties that would prefer to file a request by paper copy. As many of you know, the nationwide programmatic agreement for Section 106 streamlines the historic preservation review in the for the FCC's process. And there is a local public notice contained in that process as well. If applicants want to save time and money, they are certainly welcome to combine the local public notices. You just have to ensure that the local public notice that is published contains all of the elements of both. There's a great deal of overlap, but there are a few differences. You can see on the slide that the NPA public notice requires a street address, how to submit comments regarding potential effects on historic properties, and the name, address, and phone number of a contact person specifically for effects on historic properties. Beware of anybody trying to sell you a slot on a generic website claiming to check the box for the FCC's local public notice. It doesn't work. It's not the equivalent of a newspaper of general circulation or other appropriate means, such as through the public notice provisions of the relevant local zoning process. We already have a website that goes out nationally. Repeating that doesn't fulfill the the local public notice requirement. Requests for further environmental review, the pleading cycle, again, is based on the national notice date. So if we have gotten a request in on your proposed tower and a request has been filed and we've set up the pleading cycle, and then you want to change the national notice date, you can still do that. You can still change it to any date in the future, but you need to let us all know that everybody involved know that you're doing it. The pleading cycle is generally 30 days. It is 30 days from the national notice date. That's the comment period. After that, oppositions may be filed within 10 days, and then replies to the oppositions can be filed within 5 business days, which is just a little bit tweaked. It doesn't include weekends or holidays. Requests for further environmental review generally are required to say why the proposed tower may have a significant environmental effect and some support for that, and it's got to be written. And we do occasionally get the request that says, I think this is going to have a significant environmental effect and I don't want them to build a tower here. That's not enough. If you want to say there are eagles nesting nearby and we think this tower will have a significant effect on those eagles, that's something we can look into, but a generic statement that there will be a significant effect is not enough. The last step is Part 2 certification. That's the end of the ASR process where you certify that the proposed facility will have no significant environmental effect and choose the reason why. I have one little verbal amendment to my slide here. Sometimes I learn something more new about your side of ASR that I don't see from my side. It is possible that there can still be open pending pleadings that we haven't resolved, and your application will still show up under your ASR manager as ready for Part 2 certification. So in this case, if you know the pleadings haven't been resolved, but it still shows up there in ASR manager, you still should not complete the Part 2 certification. If you do, we will undo it and ask you not to do it again, because we have to have all the pleadings resolved. And you will know if they're resolved because we will send you a disposition basically resolving the case. I also get asked a lot, might you have to do environmental notification again for the same facility? And there are certain times when that is possible. One that I've already talked about is defects in prior public notice, if you have to do the public notice period again. Some amendments to pending ASR applications, if you change the information in your application before it's granted, and some modifications to towers after they're already registered. So the amendments to a pending ASR application would include the addition of an EA. During the comment period, you finish your environmental review and you realize that something triggers the EA requirement and you have to attach an EA. That will start the process over. Any change in the structure type or coordinates, there's no limitation of how small. Any change in that, and any change in tower height, and any change to a less preferred lighting style will require the process to start again. Things that wouldn't require the process to start again is a reduction in height, proposed lighting that goes to a more preferred style, or purely administrative changes. If you have an existing registration and you want to modify it, if you have a substantial increase in height, if you're submitting an environmental assessment, or if you're changing the lighting to a less preferred style, again, you'd have to redo the environmental notification process. Minor modifications, like you see up in the slide, do not require that. And finally, service-specific applications. So sometimes we will have a licensee need to file either a Form 601 or a Form 854. And generally, my understanding is Mike will speak more to this, but you will have the choice. You can provide the ASR registration number on Form 601 if your ASR application has already been granted, or if your ASR application has not been granted, you can still provide the ASR number on Form 601 if you've already obtained and included the FAA number on your Form 854. You've already provided local public notice of the proposed antenna, and the proposed tower has been posted on the FCC's website pursuant to the environmental notification process. And that is really it. That is the ASR application process and the environmental notification process in a nutshell, and I'm going to hand this over to Mike.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good afternoon, group. I just have a couple of short comments before we open the floor to questions. The last slide Jen put up talks of service-specific applications. And it may be obvious to the group attending, but it's worth repeating that the Commission's environmental rules and process, as you've been hearing about for the last day and a half, apply to every service that the Commission licenses: wireless services, public safety services, broadcast towers, submarine cable landing cables. It's all covered by the Commission's environmental rules, and they are the same for all services. It makes sense that wireless took the lead on this seminar, and they do the lion's share of the work. And they do, for broadcast towers, which most of them require antenna structure registration, not all, they do the work for us. They've got the subject matter experts, and where they do hundreds of environmental assessments a year, we see 3 or 4. And on the other hand, we do see them, and maybe I'm going to peg Mr. Miller later. For some reason, AM stations seem to love to construct in floodplains. I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe Mr. Miller does, and I'll get him offline later and ask about it. Maybe it's the ground conductivity is really good for AM stations, but they love floodplains. So this recent order is a very big deal for AM broadcasters. For us in the Media Bureau, the service-specific applications are essentially applications for construction permits to construct or modify broadcast
transmission facilities. And our primary forms are the Form 301 for commercial radio and television stations, the Form 318 for low-power FM stations, the Form 340 for non-commercial educational radio and television stations, the Form 346 for low-power TV and TV translator or booster stations, and the Form 349 for FM translator or booster stations. Each of these forms will, as do all forms, have an environmental certification. Now, if there are consultants, there are particularly engineering consultants who've worked with the Media Bureau's engineering staff over the years, you know very well that when an ASR is required, the Media Bureau is not going to issue an authorization until the ASR number is, the application's amended with the ASR number, if you don't have it when you file. And just as a little footnote and aside, the ancillary option listed on Jennifer's last slide for proceeding forward with, even though the application, the ASR application hasn't been given a number yet. That hasn't trickled down to us yet. So for the Media Bureau forms that are still filed in the Media Bureau's CDBS electronic filing system, we're still going to ask to see the antenna structure registration number before we grant an application. That is what I have for you. If there are questions, please.
I've got one here so
All right.
far. So this question was asked yesterday, and I'm sorry I was not in the room to answer it then. How do you recommend dealing with towers with an ASR registration that find that their location is incorrect based on outdated or erroneous previous GPS tools? Is a full new environmental assessment required? So I'm assuming that in this scenario, you're talking about a tower that's already been built and the location is just not correct in ASR. In that case, nothing physically has changed. It's just the data in ASR. I would suggest you file a modification application to correct the location, to the coordinates, the street address, if it happens to be that, and attach a waiver request asking for a waiver of the environmental notification process, and just be very clear that there has been no change to the tower, no physical change that would trigger the environmental notification process. And this is on or after June 18th, 2012. That's the date these environmental notification rules went into effect, and just explain what happened. You know, I don't need long waiver requests, but just give me all the information I need to take a look at it and just say, hey, we've updated our GPS tools. The updated technology says it's here when the old stuff said it was there, and we can process that.
We've got a question here. So what about ASR registrations for old towers? That is, an AM tower adding an FM translator, where there's no prior ASR and it's under 200 feet, but the staff now wants an ASR. That's the question we didn't want to get.
Yes. Yeah, it is possible that you may get different answers from us. And that is basically, if you come to me and ask me, I will tell you that if ASR was not required at the time of construction, then it would not be required now. And that is for WTB purposes, for the purpose that I look at it. If we go back and look at it and we can actually determine that registration was required back then we would consider it sort of an outstanding issue. But we would tell you in some cases that it's not required. Media Bureau, however, has their own need for the ASR number,
Right.
so they may still require it.
And I can assure you that we would request the ASR in this context, where it wasn't required to be registered now, but now with the addition, it would be required, and we would still look for it.
And just to add on to that, it hopefully would not be too much of a hassle, because if you got an existing tower and you're not making any major physical changes to it that would trigger the environmental notification process, you could send us a new tower application with a waiver request that says, hey, this is an existing tower. Nothing has changed on the tower that would require environmental notification since June 18th, 2012, and we want to voluntarily register it because we need it for the Media Bureau, and we can process that as well.
One coming?
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for attending.
Okay, that was the last panel, so that concludes this workshop. A couple reminders, all the presentations and the PowerPoints are available on the website for download, so you can refer to it at any point in time. I wanted to give special thanks to Myra Delau for fielding all of these questions that were coming in online. Thank you very much, Myra, as well as Irene, Connie, and Cecilia for helping grab questions from you and the live audience as they came up. Also, great thanks to the staff who make this possible, including the staff that you haven't seen, those people in the cubbyhole over there. That's right. Our AV people and Jeff Reardon and his team. There are more handouts in the back there. Feel free to grab them as you're heading out. And hopefully we'll all see you again for the training next year. Thank you very much for coming. We are a little early, and I know that some of you had flights later on in the day, so some of our staff will be circulating in the room for at least the next half hour or so if you want to come to them and have any one-on-ones with them, but otherwise, thank you for coming.